chat throughout the session. Not just to engage with us, ask questions. There's a Q&A chat and connecting with each other, exchanging those insights. Again, we are so excited to share this information that we believe will be of real service to you, your teams, your organizations. As we are gathered from many places virtually, we wish to recognize the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the indigenous peoples on which we are all currently working and living. With gratitude, we honor their enduring connection to the land, water, and community, and recognize the ongoing contributions and resilience of indigenous nations across the country. We're really glad to be bringing this group together. HAVI is convening today's conversation to create space for a range of perspectives, with myself facilitating and our speakers sharing their own professional experiences and viewpoints. So right now, I would like to take this time to ask our panel to introduce themselves. Please tell us a little bit about who you are and your background.
Buenas tardes, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Alma Mireles. I am the proud daughter of Mireles-Monsivais Olivares. I am the proud granddaughter of Maria del Carmen Olivares. I am the proud great-granddaughter of Maria Cifuentes. I honor my womb lineage and my maternal connection, and I welcome them into this space today. I am the program coordinator for AIM at Denver Health here in Denver, Colorado. I am also part of the outreach team with GRASP, Gang Rescue and Support Project. And I am very honored and privileged to be here with you all.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Trey Nowaczynski. I am a social worker. I work for the University of Chicago Medical Center. I operate as one of our pediatric violence recovery specialists, doing inpatient work. And we recently launched an outpatient program. I do part-time therapy in Chicago as well. I'm happy to share this space with you all today.
I'm Carol Olson. I'm the Associate Director of Injury and Violence Prevention at VCU Health in Virginia. And I've worked in anti-violence work for a long time before I came to hospital work through local centers and advocacy and coalition building. And now I run hospital-based injury and violence prevention programs. And I'm happy to be here. Thank you for coming.
Thank you all so much for those introductions. And I do want to acknowledge that Brother LoveJoy was unable to join us today due to some unforeseen kind of travel things out there. So we do just want to, I do want to acknowledge that he was supposed to be here. I want to say we are just grateful for his willingness to contribute to this discussion. So just wanted to acknowledge him. And so in our last webinar, if anybody was there, hopefully many of you were there, we spoke about that beyond burnout, right? And in that, we talked about vicarious trauma, burnout, and what that looks like. So Trey, I'm going to put this definition on the screen, and I would like to ask you to really ground us in the foundation of this webinar today by defining vicarious trauma again and how it manifests.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marquita. So for those of you who joined us for our first faculty webinar, we discussed the costs of caring, some of the impacts that inevitably come home with us as clinicians. And we know that the work that we do changes us. And this profession doesn't ask, but rather that it demands us to be consistent, to be prepared to confront some of the most traumatic moments in our communities. This means that we're constantly steeped in this brew of vicarious trauma, structural inequities, political incongruences while we do this work. So what's meant by this vicarious trauma is that it's something that can disrupt a person's fundamental beliefs about the world and interpersonal relationships due to this kind of repeated long-term exposure to traumatic material. For us, then, it means that secondary traumatic stress is kind of the normal, consequential, and often unavoidable reactions that we might have, particularly within these helping professions. And in today's discussion, we seek to analyze some of the ways that this exposure stays with us. Over time, when those kinds of reservoirs of hurt, pain, and grief become unattended to, we'll see predictable consequences that all of us have witnessed across the field. We do this because we care, because we know that our liberation is bound to that of our neighbors and everyone around us. So you're far from alone in these feelings and these experiences, and we're honored to be able to have this conversation with you all today.
Thank you so much, Trey. Really appreciate you really grounding us in that and just what is, in this work that we do, right? And so to start off this webinar, we really want to get you all engaged again, right? Like last time. And so we want to start this off with you. So if you remember last time, we had a Mentimeter question, and I want to ask you all again to what things come to mind when you hear the word grief? And so I want you, let me see, and then hold on, let me put, you can use that code that's up here. And before I had my little, let me see, I had a little, if you see the code that's up there, you can dial 8368-2825. Good, there we go. We're getting some things. Thank you. I'm seeing a lot: sadness, anger, emotional turmoil. Sadness and anger are some of the biggest ones, right? I believe that many are feeling when you hear the word grief. Loss. Oh, someone has forgiveness. Alone.
A lot of powerful stuff on here, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of powerful words. What are some of the things that you all are seeing that's really
Forever,
coming up to you?
forever standing out. Love is standing out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I really appreciate the acknowledgement and the awareness of these big feelings and these big emotions. I think that sometimes we, as part of the discomfort, and part of our survival is, and our conditioning is to avoid all of these big feelings and emotions, and bringing awareness to it and acknowledging them. I think that it's very, very, very powerful.
Absolutely, I agree. Thank you all. Thank you all for sharing that. Because as we get into this, webinar, is really important to understand, and get an idea of what that looks like for you, what that feels like for you as we move into this webinar. So thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts with this question. And, for my next question, as we move forward, I want to talk about the historical context of grief and loss, especially when we are talking about marginalized communities and what we are seeing today. So I just want to read this definition of grief, and then again, really get into the historical context of it. So grief is the profound emotional, physical, and psychological response to significant loss, such as death, divorce, or major life changes. It is a natural, non-linear process, often felt in waves, encompassing emotions like sadness, anger, and guilt. Coping involves seeking support, maintaining routines, and allowing time to process emotions. Grief within African American and BIPOC communities is deeply rooted in historical, intergenerational trauma stemming from slavery, colonialism, and systemic violence, which compounds personal loss with collective ongoing trauma. So, and I'll start with you, Alma. If you can just uh, help us dig a little bit more into the historical context of grief and loss, and especially in marginalized communities.
Thank you, Marquita. Before doing that, I would really like to invite us all to hold space and a moment of silence. And the reason for this is because I also want to acknowledge all of the historical events that have happened that have been put in place in a way to disconnect us and steer us away from our identity. And so I would really like to take this moment to acknowledge and honor all of those who have passed on and transitioned into the spirit world. I want to take this moment and intentionally honor all of the families that are being separated during this climate and that are being dehumanized. I want to take this moment and honor all of the women who have been missing and murdered, who have not found any justice. I want to take this time to honor and acknowledge all of the men who have been intentionally removed from our communities and our households. I want to intentionally acknowledge and honor all of our young people who sometimes don't feel or believe that there's another way out of darkness. I do this because as we speak in this about this historical grief, it's important to acknowledge a lot of the things that have been in place that have been meant to separate us, to disconnect us from our sacredness, and to disconnect us from our identity.
Thank you so much for that. And before we, continue, especially getting that deeper look into that historical context. And before we go, further, I really want to understand what grief is. And so I read that definition of grief. We looked at a little bit of that history of what that looks like, in our African American and BIPOC communities. And I really want to know, how does grief manifest? What do those symptoms look like? And I want to ask you, Carol, if you're able to, discuss with us a little more on that and help us really and guide us really into what is grief? What does that look like? How does that manifest?
Coughing a little bit, everybody. So the traditional stages of grief generally go 1 through 5, and they're denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And what that means is denial is often the refusing to acknowledge the reality of death or avoiding the conversation. A lot of people go through that. Almost everybody goes through it initially. Some people even forget the death happened. You might encounter someone who a week later is like, they didn't die. And that's what grief is. It's really your brain like putting a blocker in on painful memories or painful events. And then not wanting to talk to anybody about it. And there's no length of time that lasts. People can sometimes move to anger next, though they don't necessarily go in order, as you can see from the experience you got. But anger is when people start to accept the reality of death, but feel angry towards themselves or others. They may blame others. Parents may blame themselves for the loss of a child, even if it was an accident. People may blame doctors or health systems for not either not being able to give adequate care, or we blame society for the loss we have in terms of gun violence and violence in other interpersonal violence. And it's interesting that was one of the larger ones in the Menti that you did was anger. I think we all feel that, and often it's toward ourselves and our own sense of helplessness, and trying to deal with grief and loss and the things that bring us to that, whether it's personal or societal. And we go through this with personal loss, but we also go through a societal loss, like things that happen to our community, to our society at large. And then there's bargaining. You try to negotiate your bargaining way out of the system. God, if you help me with this, I'll never let this happen again. Or for yourself, if that happened and I didn't love them enough, I wasn't there for them enough, and I'm going to do that for the next person, or I'm going to make sure I take them to the doctor. And it's bargaining with yourself. If you had done something different, would the outcome have been different? And that can become very large if it's somebody that you lost contact with for a while, or if you're in a conflict, especially with a sibling, or a parent, or a grandparent, or even a friend or a workmate. And after that, people can experience loss and depression. And again, sadness was the largest one in the Mentimeter. Everyone experienced sadness, and that can look like depression. You lack energy, and we relate to fatigue. People put that in the Mentimeter. The sense of tiredness you have, because emotional healing takes energy. Despair, feelings of sadness, feelings of hopelessness, all accompany that. And they can cause you to isolate and withdraw. They can cause you to eat less, sleep less, and stop taking care of yourself. And we call it depression, but it can look like irritability. It can look like anxiety. There's a lot of things that fit in with depression. But a lot of times it's just your emotional path. Once you get past denial and anger and past the bargaining, where you're really letting it settle on you. This is where you hear people saying, you can't avoid loss. You can't avoid feelings. You have to move through them. And that would be moving through this. And unfortunately, depression and sadness, and they're large feelings, and they take energy. And then you get to acceptance. So you don't struggle as much with death or grief. You come to terms with the reality. You may have forgiven yourself if you felt responsible, and you start to move forward with your life. Doesn't mean you forget, but it means that it doesn't weigh on you as much, and you can start to move forward. But as always, you can actually go all the way to acceptance, and then 2 years later, a trigger event happens, and you can be back to feeling anger or bargaining. You can even step back all the way to denial. So that really is just a very convoluted path, and just knowing that some of these things don't resolve in 5 weeks, like it might look like. It can be a lifetime of sometimes navigating grief and stages of grief. We can go to the next slide. You want to go to the next slide? Okay. And so there's dual process model of grief. There's you in the middle, and things that are loss oriented that might keep you in the depression stage or the anger stage are things like focusing on photo albums more than average or more than normal, only playing music that reminds you of them, focusing on my life changed. If I had my old life, then I wouldn't feel like this at all. Tributes to honor them can be good for that moment, but staying present in that can actually become what we call maladaptive coping skills. Talking with friends can be healing in the beginning, but it can leave you stuck if it goes on too much. Journaling is helpful, actually. But when you move from loss-oriented to restoration and you've gotten to acceptance, you start to develop new routines and habits. They use an example of working through a budget, but that's just you work through tasks related to it, or you can be more structurally functional in things. You're adjusting to a new family role if the loss was within the family. If your parents died and you are now the oldest person, or there's often that phrase that you never really grow up until your parents pass away, and then you're the next adult in line. You make new friends. If the loss is a partner or friends, or you were very close to a sibling, you start to make new friends. So you re-engage in socialization and you reduce your isolation. And you start to create new traditions, especially around holidays. People at the beginning of that first year following a loss, especially if it's a family member or a loved one, some of the triggering events could be every single holiday in that first year. If you have specialized traditions over, certain holidays, you have to create new ones in order to be able to stay in acceptance or maintenance. And that can be very difficult, especially if the person you lost was very much the person who created the traditions. An example for me is when my father died, Christmas was his thing, and he kind of set it all up. And when he died, we sat around not knowing what to do when Christmas happened. And it took a really long time for us to set a new pattern. And it's just hard because that was his thing. Other holidays were easier to reorganize, but not that one. And that could be with whatever holidays you celebrate or whatever marker events are in your life. It can be hard to, if you have weddings coming up. I didn't have my dad there, and that became another triggering event for me for a moment, or marker events in your life. You can also have with larger events that happen in our community that are a great loss to us, deaths that happen. Look, for Richmond, we had, multiple deaths over this past weekend, and families and the community itself is grieving and having anxiety. And then those events will come back up every year of, remember when that happened, remember her name, and they can focus us back on those. And that can trigger maybe trying to make change in society if we can. So anyway, those are ways to look at it. Some things are loss oriented, which are, work really well in the beginning, but at some point you need to move toward restoration, and restoration is change. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol, for really, really helping us understand, what grief looks like, how it manifests, what those symptoms are. And, what you were saying is it's not a linear process, right? It's not a straight going through, as you had said, where, denial straight all the way to acceptance, right? So, this is going to be convoluted. We're going to go, through it in different ways. And even when we think we've reached acceptance, there can be a trigger, right, that can put us right back probably at the beginning again. And so, before or, as we, think about that, and you had talked about that trigger, I want to ask now, and especially want to come to you now, Trey, are you able to describe instances of grief that you have experienced and what that was like for you? And I also want to know, how do you identify possible triggers of your grief?
Thank you, Marquita. Carol, I think this is very much in alignment with where I'm heading here with some of my own personal reflections on grief. So I grew up in Milwaukee. I know that I'm in Chicago now, but some of you Milwaukee folks in the audience might recognize some of this. Thank you for the space here. So in the December of 2012, a young man named Corey Stingley was murdered at VJ's Food Mart in West Allis, Wisconsin. Corey was my peer. He was a class younger than me, a local rival on the football field and on the track. I have to believe that his experience was similar to mine. He was one of the only Black boys in his graduating class in a first-ring suburb. He was beloved as an athlete, but more importantly, as a friend. Corey was put into a chokehold and pinned down by two men performing a citizen's arrest after a shoplifting event that involved $12 worth of alcohol. Corey was unconscious when the ambulance arrived and later died of asphyxia in the hospital. While the pain of losing a peer so senselessly was potent enough, the racially charged reactions of my community haunt me to this day. Without being verbose, all of the accusations and inferences and social media posts carried the same message. It didn't matter who he was. He was Black. But grief for me was already a sleeping giant within waiting to reveal itself. Grief is something that I've lived with my whole life until I even knew how to articulate what it was. Grief was the self-doubt that crept into my beliefs about who I am, the self-comparison, the thief of joy that made me question who I was and if I was even deserving of love. My last name, as you can see, is Polish. And despite my obvious Polish features, that isn't consistent with my ethnic heritage. I was adopted at birth in Milwaukee by a loving family who has always proudly been stable and supported me. As a young person, I was fortunate enough to only know this kind of unconditional love, watching my parents pour into their careers as teachers, social service providers, and the like. Even at this moment, I see their names in the audience holding me up. It wasn't until later in my life that a series of pivotal events shook my understanding of who I was and how the world saw me. My schools were mostly white. I never had a teacher who wasn't until I was in high school. So I was privy to racism, but until that 2012 moment, I couldn't really comprehend exactly how it was embedded so deeply in my life. So in 2012, I'm going to age myself here. I was preparing for high school graduation and about to move away from home for the first time. I was left with this hollow sense of fragile being, had this ambiguous loss that manifested into fear, rage, and intense self-isolation. Month after month, year after year, I witnessed the American media debate the humanity of my skin, justifying broad day murders in Florida, St. Louis, Akron, Ohio, St. Paul, Minneapolis, Baltimore, Texas, New York, and across the globe. The world around me erupted into divisions that conditionally permitted me to live. Every police killing echoes Corey's death, pushing me closer and closer to this career. So what did grief take from me? Grief suppressed my confidence. It made me feel afraid to advocate for myself. It took away from my opportunities and life paths that no longer felt safe and reliable. It took my creativity. I became too defeated to draw, to play my favorite instruments, to let myself feel joy. And it pushed me to vices that became unhealthy coping mechanisms. Grief made me skeptical of my best friends, my family, myself. Grief makes me resent the reflection of myself that I see in the mirror today. To be clear, grief is something that I still live with every single day. I speak to you today still in the process of healing, with more awareness perhaps about how that grief operates for me. And as much as I have anthropomorphized grief here, it really is only an emotion. It's a piece of information, as painful as it might come. Knowing it, naming it, and accepting it is the only way to face it. And it's a part of me, like an open flame that has to be tamed, but reminds me of a warmth that I once was more familiar with. So it comes to me when I speak to families in the height of their anxiety, arriving to the hospital after the news that their loved one was stabbed and is now in surgery. It's with me when survivors of domestic violence grapple with the brutalities of the legal system and the silence at home. It's with me when I work with kids who will never walk again because of their spinal cord injuries. And it's with me when I hold the hands of a mother in the moments before she finds out that her child has taken their last breath. For me, the calmness in my hands, clamminess in my palms, shriveled pit in my stomach, and a shortness of breath that's only punctuated by an intensified rhythm in my heart. When these feelings come up for me, I think about Corey. I think about the families separated by borders, children forced to work in dangerous conditions, disappeared Indigenous women, the countless murders of Black and trans women, and I think about the pain of this world, but the grief no longer makes me fearful. I'm also reminded of the networks of mutual aid that we've built, the balloon releases, the block parties, and the altars where we celebrate our memories. I think about Corey's dad, who fought for 13 years to get a conviction. And on January 15th, 2026, 2 men pled guilty to murdering his son. Grief will always be with you in this work and in the world beyond. But if we're going to build a world that we desire, we can't let it diminish our light. Our resistance is fueled by grief because our grief is a memory of love. It's an acknowledgement of what we've lost, and it keeps the memory of our loved ones alive, their stories embodied through us. When we can harness the truth in our pain, it becomes something more powerful, and that is where we need to live. Thank you.
Wow, thank you for sharing that, Trey. That is so powerful. It's so relatable. As I'm sitting here and holding space and receiving what you have to share, um, I can't help but to really understand the everything that coexists within us when we speak about grief, right? It's a roller coaster. For me, I've experienced loss from a very, very young age. My first memory, losing my father in the motherland, which is the reason why we had to come to the U.S. But also that feeling of disconnection in this new world, in this new space, the disconnection from our foods, from our family, from our traditions, from our language, right? Having to adapt to all of these new things that just seem so unfair. And then, as a teenager, just, living through so much violence and losing so many people that I love as a result of that. Most recently, I know that I shared this with you all, and I take this moment to honor Andy Campos Padilla, who was a client of mine. He was someone that I was working with when I first started working here with Denver Youth Programs. And, he lost his life shortly after I started working with him. And he lost his life to a fentanyl overdose. And Andy, had the works. When we speak about the works, I mean, he had a GAL, he had an attorney, he had a therapist for this, a therapist for that. He had the works. He had a whole team working with him, but yet he still died a month after being released from incarceration, right? And so, that really that really changed me as a person, because I felt high levels of anger. I was pissed off, and in that moment, destruction and retaliation was what I've known in the past, and it almost made sense to me in that moment, right? Um, I didn't know that in the state of Colorado, in the time of his passing, there was only one inpatient facility with a 6-bed capacity for underage youth under the age of 18. A 6-bed capacity for the entire state of Colorado for underage youth on Medicaid. Um, there was no detox facility available at all for underage youth on Medicaid in the entire state of Colorado. And so it just reminded me of the historic conditioning of not really having access to resources or even humanizing us or dignifying our struggle and our challenges, right? And the way that we face barriers as we navigate this world and this life. And so, I had to relearn to channel my anger. I was pissed off. I had to relearn to channel it in a way that was constructive, right? And as a result, there was a bill that was passed here in Colorado, HB 22-1283, and Section 5 of that law is called the Andy Campos Padilla Act. And there was so much money released that allowed several inpatient facilities with up to a 16-bed capacity for our youth. So there are more opportunities for our young people to go receive treatment and support as a result. There is now a detox facility for underage youth on Medicaid at Denver Health. That didn't exist for Andy, right? And so I've learned to embrace grief. I've learned to embrace anger. Something that Nina Simone has said in the past in one of her interviews is that anger is a beautiful thing. Anger leads to action, and action leads to change. And, earlier when we had the Mentimeter, there was all these emotions that were being, acknowledged, and anger was one of them. And it's a beautiful thing that we're not staying away from the big emotions and the big feelings that a lot of us are carrying. I think that it's important to also to acknowledge that, we carry, as Black and brown people, indigenous people, we carry different layers of grief and different layers of trauma. And although in the moment we're experiencing these big feelings and emotions, we're also feeling them through our DNA and ancestral connection. And so grief and healing always looks different for us.
Thank you both so much. Thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you, because I know even when you were speaking, there was so much, not only the passion, but the emotions that came from you as you shared what you shared. So thank you for the vulnerability. Thank you for taking that time for us to understand that and see what that looks like, right? And what you have gone through yourselves when it comes to grief, and then what we experience in this work. Because not only can this work expose us to the various forms of violence, and then not only what you have maybe experienced in your own individual and personal life. As Trey read earlier, we have vicarious trauma, and we went back over that. We understood what it was. We understood and how it manifested again. But then, we're not only exposed to that trauma, to vicarious trauma, but we're also exposed to vicarious grief. And so I want to move into, that vicarious grief and understand that and what that looks like, because that's probably a new term to really understand, right? We mainly hear vicarious trauma. We, sometimes have heard the secondary traumatic stress, but we really haven't gone over vicarious grief. And so I want to really be able to understand what does that look like. And so I want to share this definition, and then I want to go into what that looks like. And so vicarious grief is a profound emotional and empathetic response to another person's or community's loss. It represents genuine grief triggered by witnessing or hearing about the suffering of others. Symptoms are similar to direct grief. It includes crying, feelings of heaviness, emptiness, sleep, appetite changes, and preoccupation with the loss. Not only that, we do see that there are a couple types of vicarious grief, right? So we have type 1, where the vicarious griever feels what it must be like for the bereaved. And then type 2, where the vicarious griever is experiencing their own grief based on a personal loss while still empathizing with the bereaved. And so I want to just take this time, to really understand what now this word is, right? What is vicarious grief? And I want to, really ask you, Trey, if you can elaborate a little bit more on what that looks like, because I remember hearing through your story, I believe you really expressed a lot of this vicarious grief. And so I want to know if you can just take us a little deeper into vicarious grief and what that looks like.
Absolutely. Yeah, so much of my pathway to violence recovery work has been about this vicarious grief. I not that I haven't had my own personal instances, personal relationships impacted by gun violence, but those kinds of instances of trauma ring out across communities. And even when they're not personal relationships, even when they're not, localized in the places where you live and call home, I think it's important to recognize that you most likely are being impacted by it, but especially when you're doing this kind of work, you're constantly posed with these realities that, there are structural conditions, there are historically grounded foundations and policies in this country in particular that have created these kinds of conditions. And grieving the lives that we've lost and the lives that we won't get to see out has something that has just always stayed with me. And I think I alluded to this earlier, but the kind of pain that makes you feel sometimes doesn't feel valid. You're frustrated and, you know, constantly inundated with these news cycles. And ultimately, the American mindset would tell you that you don't have to worry about it. It's not you. It's not my family. If I'm living like an individual, I'm not connected to those things. But we know that that's not true about the state of humanity. We know that's not true about who we are and what keeps us connected to our light. So to me, vicarious grief is both a new concept, but also something that is the most salient experience in my life. I can't help but feel the things that are going on around me, and it's okay to name that they bring up your own feelings, that it's something that has an impact on you. And it doesn't mean that you're centering yourself, but as folks that do this work, I think it becomes increasingly important for us to understand how vicarious grief shows up for us when it's most present, and if it's impacting our ability to both do this work and show up as ourselves.
Thank you, Trey. And Carol, Alma, anything like, when you hear that vicarious grief, does that, what does that sound like or feel like for you as well? Does it, anything you can also share with us on that vicarious grief and what you've seen?
Sure, I can go next. I came from a culture that in a very small town and very culturally specific, and they didn't have like community grief. And so it wasn't it was kind of a culture that's like bad things happen and life is hard and then you die in a nutshell. And people, you don't go to the hospital because that's where you go to die. And I know it sounds horrible, doesn't it? It's that way. But Norwegian parents. But and so I really didn't come to be in a community that responded to vicarious grief until I moved here to Virginia and worked in social services and worked in community mental health, and really learned that grief really extends beyond you and from the community to you. And it was an enlightening experience and also a painful one, but it brought me that if you do come from a culture where you don't really, like, grief and loss is just very compartmentalized and you don't talk about it with anybody, and you don't, like, it can be a little overwhelming at first, but it's also enlightening and helped me learn how to be closer to my community, whether they look like me or not, helped me work with, my family that started marrying and outside of our specific ethnicity of Norwegian. And it's hard, but it'll also let me, I with my team, we experience vicarious grief all the time when you work in injury and violence prevention, and seeing it in the community. I can be better now prepared to support my team and know that they're going to be feeling that this shooting in our community with multiple people injured will resonate for quite a long time. And my staff are reeling from it, and the community is reeling from it, whether they were involved or not, And so I think even if it is not an orientation that you have culturally, to move toward that, because it helps you connect to your greater community and realize that we are all involved in anything that happens in our community. And along with death, oppression, violence, accidents, I don't know. I don't know if that was what else to say. So, thanks. Alma, save me.
What I wanted to add is, I was just sharing earlier that the reason why many of us are so passionate and show up full-heartedly and go so hard for our community is because we are the community, right? and our own children, our own families, ourselves, we're not immune to any of the discrimination or any of the social issues that are happening in our communities right now. I know that I've shared, in a form of respect and acknowledgement and to honor. We've had several team members who have lost their own children to gun violence and drug overdose. And that has affected us as team members, because we walk so firmly together that if one of us is hurting, we're all hurting. And understanding that all of these social issues are not something that specifically me personally, I'm not showing up because I want to make a difference. I'm showing up because when I was growing up, I didn't have anyone showing up for me. And I don't ever want anyone to feel that they're not seen, that they don't feel important, that they don't feel like anyone cares. I was just sharing that my existence as a person is the way that I breathe hope back into the lives of my community, my people, and my young people, right? And so the types of vicarious grief or vicarious grief, we don't it's not just of man, like that, I feel sad for you. It's, man, I know how that feels because I was there. And because I was there, I know what it's like, right? I think that is what a lot of us who are frontlining experience when we are showing up in these spaces. We're not doing it for a paycheck. We're not doing it because we want to be able to count numbers for grant purposes. We're doing it. I know that I speak for myself. We're doing it because in a moment in our lives, no one was there to show up for us. And it's important that through healing, we also show our young people, our communities, our the families that we work with, that they do matter, and that one day we're gonna step back and we're not gonna lead the fight. There will be the one stepping up leading these fights, right? And it's a big responsibility, but we're also part of a research team, and I always share, it takes a lion to know a lion. So people can spend a lifetime doing research work, being out there in the jungles, really getting familiar with lion behavior. But at the end of the day, it takes a lion to know a lion. And I'm so glad, and I'm so privileged, and I'm so honored that I can hold space, and hold some of these intense emotions, but because I understand the responsibility of doing so.
Yeah, I think, Alma, you are bringing up really, really important things about why we're here, why we do this work. And that knowledge of, I know what it feels like. I know where we've been. For me, when I go to the emergency department and, I see somebody who looks just like me laying on the table, I instantly am thinking about all the people that care about this person. How is this going to impact their relationships? What is this like? I don't even know if family members are going to show up to the hospital, but already I'm doing the internal work of who's going to miss this person, who's going to miss out on a father, a brother, somebody that they look up to and care about, and that instantly drives me to show up in whatever capacity, because I know that it hasn't happened before.
It's so interesting when we are on our way into this world, right? There's so many people anticipating our arrival. There's so much joy that comes with our arrival. But when we depart, it's very painful, and it's very heavy when we're the only people there. We're not using terminology as, oh, expired at this time. It's someone just took their last breath, and we were privileged enough to be there to see them part, right? And I think that that's part of the unique, attributes that we bring into this field as Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, that we understand the sacredness of someone's life. We understand the sacredness that regardless of decision making abilities, regardless of how or why you ended up in this hospital today, you're still someone's child. You are the world to somebody, right? And it's important to always make sure that we keep that human perspective 100% of the time.
Yeah.
Because historically, we've been conditioned to remove ourselves from our humanity for a reason.
And I would even argue that some of the systems that we work in do that and replicate those same things, right? So it's even more important to witness, to be present, and to show up and honor those lives. Because unfortunately, I've seen a lot of disrespect when people are departing, and that just doesn't sit with me. So,
And to make sure we teach the next generation, like of not only our, my nieces and nephews and the people, young people in my life, but also the people who work with me and work for me, just to make sure that we pass on that kind of cultural understanding and significance and awareness of what this means to everybody, and that coming together as a community to deal with grief helps everyone. And it helps enlighten our society overall.
Thank you all so much. And I do want to highlight, even, when you all were, speaking and really speaking about vicarious grief and what that looks like and how you've experienced and seen it yourself, and just understanding that, everyone feels this, right? And we feel it together. I do want to highlight some of the things that when many of our participants who's in this webinar right now, when they were answering those questions, right, and they were talking about some of the things that they were seeing and some of the things that they were experiencing, I want to just highlight that a few of those right now, some of the things that we saw in those responses, just to lift their voices into this space as we're moving through it and looking at that. And some of the things that they were saying, and it really encompassed a lot of what you all have said. It was, the political climate has really impacted youth, families, and, them individually and their teams. Enduring the loss has presented depression, sadness, reflection of purpose, frustration, and anger. And then those were a lot of the words we even saw, as we did the Mentimeter, right? And was gaining what grief looks like. Many of them said that it was the loss of patience. It's been loss of jobs. It's been loss of team members. It's been loss of family. It's been concerns of funding in their programs. So, there's been so much that, those who are on this webinar right now with us, that they have been experiencing with this grief and loss. So I really want to acknowledge that and really bring their voice into this space.
Well, the political climate has shifted so much, for not just for the community, for our families, but for ourselves. I can speak to you about how it's affected me, right? I am now having to create action plans for myself whenever I go to court with one of my young people or their families. I have to make sure that I'm checking in with my loved ones, to make sure that they know that I'm okay. We have a plan that if they don't hear from me from, after a specific time, call this number to see if they have me there, right? Make sure that they have the correct spelling of my full name, my birthday, I'm a green card holder, my A number, you know what I mean? Because an A number in this country, it means an alien. And it is intentional to separate me from my humanity, right? But unfortunately, this is the only way that I will be identified in this corrupted system. And so political climate has called on, when Carol was talking about, losing a parent, and as the older child, having to step in and kind of become now the head of house, we see that as well. And there's a lot of community members that are having to face this, not because their parents are passing or transitioning into the spirit world, but because some of their parents might be removed. They will be kidnapped and sent back. And now we have to put this plan together of the next child up, who might be 15 or 16, to take on that role for the 8-year-olds, the 2-year-olds, right? And so it is so much happening right now, in our communities, that this political climate has really presented an opportunity for us to re-strategize, to reconnect, to reprogram, to come together as a community and hold each other, to make sure that we are making efforts to see the humanity in us when our humanity is being stripped away. So as horrible as this moment feels and has felt for the last year, I am now seeing it as an opportunity, for empowerment, for courage, for community, for just resilience.
And it's hard to not see those things when you are looking for them, right? I think my contemporary example right now is looking at Minneapolis, loss of life of 2 civilians, and a community response to the occupation, right? You have neighbors taking care of neighbors, people signing up for networks, watch shifts, things that really do keep us safe. And the only ways to restore our humanity in the face of these kinds of vile systems, is to return to those things that which make us human.
When we want to, like in the Western ways, we talk about, mental health, or these diagnoses. I firmly believe that it's a disalignment of the spirit. Something caused our spirit to disalign, right? And so healing comes through the realignment of our spirit. It's returning to spirit. And the way that we are able to return to spirit is by reaching out and staying connected. It is by practicing our ancestral, our cultural practices. It is by honoring all of the pain and the struggles and being the voice of those who have been voiceless. It is the opportunity to stand up, even if we're scared, but stand up and face whatever is coming to us, right? That is how we return to spirit and restore it.
Thank you, Alma. And I love that you just talked about healing, because I want to move into healing, because we've just gone into some deep stuff, right? We've talked about some deep things that have produced some emotions, even in us. And I want to know, as you were just passionately talking about that healing, what does that healing look like, right? Some people use therapy, art, faith, spirituality. When we were looking through the responses again of many people on this, of everyone on this webinar, I saw therapy, breath work, spirituality, right? A lot of these responses. And I want to know, what are some of the successful ways you have been able to use for healing, both individually and collectively?
Um, sorry, Marquita, you were on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry. I know I hit mute, but I said I'd love to go back to you. You were passionate as you were moving into that healing. I'd love to continue for you to continue on that healing.
Well, for me, I understand that healing isn't a one-way journey, and it's not linear, right? Healing is a day-to-day effort. It is a decision I make. every single day. You know, this summer, July 29th, I will be celebrating 20 years clean and sober. And so that has also allowed me to receive a new opportunity at life. And every single day that I'm able to show up, I understand my responsibility in the way that I show up. Healing for me is being aware. It's facing all this ugliness. It's making sure that I acknowledge that it's okay to be angry. It's okay to want to slap somebody in that moment. It's okay to, want to burn shit down. It's okay to feel that and think that. What is not okay is to act on it, right? And so understanding that I don't always have the solutions, I don't know it all. I'm 44 years old and I feel like I'm barely learning, how to navigate life. And so for me, healing is understanding, and really acknowledging all of the people in my life that pour into me, so that when my vision becomes blurry, I can reach out to them and borrow their strength. Healing to me means being the mother that I didn't have because my mother didn't know how to show up for me in a motherly way. It means, having my older daughter become the first one in our family to graduate from high school. It means being the first one in our family to make it to 22 with no children and no criminal record. That's what healing looks like to me. It doesn't look like one thing or one size fits all. It doesn't look like, therapy. It even looks like me stepping out of my front door and really appreciating the beauty that surrounds me, nature, breathing fresh air, right? And so I take advantage of all of these beautiful spaces and all of these opportunities, and I'm always in a spirit of learning and receiving. So for me, healing doesn't look one way or some practices. Cooking my foods with my family, our traditional foods, teaching my daughters our traditional dishes in our traditional ways with our traditional ingredients. That to me is healing. Liberation is healing.
Tremendous. Um, Alma, selfishly, I'm gonna fanboy real quick. I heard you speak once upon a time at another hobby event, and I knew that this conversation was going to be as fruitful because of your presence. Um, Brilliant to hear, brilliant to be here with you. I could not agree more. I'm hearing healing is generational, it's embodied, it's rooted in community, it's nonlinear, it's ancestral, it is liberatory. These are the things that carry us when we are, you know, embattled with the grief that is vicarious or otherwise, the things that are the most difficult. Returning to this understanding of healing is it's everything. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if I can add to that. It's really great.
Absolutely.
Elma's going to be a national speaker soon. But yeah, obviously I agree with all of it. And because as we talked about, loss and grief is isolating. And so healing is bringing yourself out of isolation. And oppressive systems actually implement isolating events or isolating structures to prevent people from coming together to grieve together and heal. Excuse me. And so, breaking that in our overall societal structure is important as well, so that our communities heal together. I'm sorry, I'm coughing.
And then the piece that I really love here, for me, healing has always been about education, and not necessarily in the traditional sense. Like you don't have to go to college, you don't need a master's degree or to be a doctor to understand how to learn. So I feel like I learn in community, I learn from women, I learn from the people that are all around me, and being able to understand that it's not an acknowledgement of being less than that I don't know these things, more than it is an opportunity to draw connections between struggles that are not necessarily at home in my community. So, when we think about what's going on in Cuba, Iran, or the Congo, Palestine, Venezuela, Puerto Rico, all across the world, these kinds of struggles, the kind of healing that's happening, these things are all so interconnected. Beyond the structures that create the conditions, the ways that we get out of them are also interlinked. And that's something that if we close ourselves off to the rest of the world and we self-isolate, even within our own communities, which we unfortunately see as a political tactic being used against us here, when we can break free of that and we find that interconnectedness, that intersectionality, they can't stop us. I'm telling you.
Thank y'all. And it reminds me, and it starts to bring me into the community, right? And it starts to bring us into really community healing. And a lot of that is, what does that look like, right? When we talk about community healing, we've heard cultural healing before, community grounding. We know that culture heals. When everyone came on to this webinar, I had the African drumming circles playing, right? We really I want to, understand that traditional, what we did traditionally to heal as a community, to heal as a culture. What does that look like? And what is that? So can you please, tell us a little bit about cultural healing? Tell us about community grounding and healing and what that looks like.
Something that I'm very, very proud within our organization is that our team is mostly, we are mostly Black and brown, frontline workers. And we come from a background that we were not meant to be walking together. For many different reasons, for many different purposes. And, within our destructive ways, we were taught and conditioned to hate each other, to stay away from each other, to not honor each other, right? And something that I take so much pride in, especially in this with this team, is that we are collectively walking together. We are collectively, restoring the hope together. We are showing up in spaces and taking up space, together. And so I think that it's important for our community to see us collectively doing the work day in and day out. That means, it means showing up and meeting the need as the need presents itself. There is no agenda. There is no, this is how we do it. This is, you know what I mean? If it means that someone in community is in need of movers, we show up and we help them move. I know that I've showed up to a family's home where there was an open case with the Department of Human Services in Denver. And, social work wanted to remove the kids because one of the kids was infested with lice. So, neglect. And I'm like, you know what? Let's go get the shampoo. And I sat there with the mom, and we cleaned out the little girl's hair. I've shown up to our family's homes, that we work with, and, help them clean up their home, because the social worker is going to come do a home visit. And if they see some clutter or whatever, that's a symptom of dysfunction or neglect. You know what I mean? And so restoring the trust in community, or the healing in community, is being able to step into spaces where there might be gunshots in the background, but you're still showing up, and you're letting the families know you matter. You're showing up even when the house is cluttered, and you sit there and you roll up your sleeves and you help them clean that home, that space, right? Because they also deserve to live in a sacred space. You show up with them, not judgmental, not with an agenda, but instead saying, hey, I see you. How can I step up and support you?
And I'd also, if you can, Alma, as well, just digging, as I said, a little bit more also into some of those traditional indigenous practices and the drumming circle and, what that does and how that's medicine and how that heals, especially in culture.
Well, I work with some of the young people that I work with. They're mostly young men, right? And it's a privilege. But a lot of them have unhealthy relationships with some of their parents, and as a need, we've created a space for the mothers of these young men to come together once every second Friday of the month during a Mujeres Circle. And it's a beautiful thing to see the mothers come together and to see the mothers, also share and receive, and the way that it's then seen with the young boys, right? And how their family dynamics begin to shift, how that restoration of trust begins to shift, how even though my young client might be struggling, the fact that he knows that his mom trusts this space allows him to trust that we're going to show up for him in a good way, right? And so because we can't just show up and provide services for one member of the family. We have to be able to see the family as a unit, right? And so and this is how healing also what it looks like. It's being to acknowledge, it's being to know who your godparents are. It's knowing who your probation officers are, not because I'm gonna go snitch or I'm gonna be nosy, but because when you need someone to step up, I'm gonna be that voice when you feel voiceless, right? And so that is what I believe community healing also looks like. It's intergenerational.
Trey, Carol, any thoughts on that? What community and culture healing looks like for you as well?
I mean, for me, it's acknowledging when things happen, growing out of how I was raised, and talk about things. And with my friends, with my team, and that even if it didn't happen to us or somebody they knew, it's still part of our community. And sitting down with my team when something happens, because it could, our patients will be affected by anything that goes on in the community. And so will my friends who all live here and are part of this community. And I have a very diverse friend group and a very diverse staff. And so making sure that people who do tend to compartmentalize and not talk about things, acknowledge, and like, this does affect you and this affects all of us. And if we talk about it, if we acknowledge it and put a name on, have moments of silence, then we can be a part of the greater community, whether someone sees us or not, and helps us move forward, as a team, and then be more empathetic to our patients going forward. I work at a level 1 trauma center, and that whole culture, as Marquita knows, is very, treat to street and move on. And so it's just breaking that kind of conception that not your patient, you don't have to worry about it, or they're gone now, let's move on to the next one. That instead, like, it's a loss to everyone, and whether or not, and then a loss to our community, and we serve the community. And so we will have patients coming in reeling from what happens, and we can be a part of their healing, but it also means helping mentor people to understand, like, you need to move toward that, at least for me, the people who didn't grow up that way, and I also don't want to put the burden on the Black or brown community that they have to, train everybody else, but instead, like, let's model this and go forward so that we're all part of this, wherever you live.
Yeah, I find that healing is something that must happen in community. There are, there's self work that has to happen, of course, but um, we talked about this at our last webinar. Like culture heals when we lose somebody, when somebody departs, we get together, we cook for each other, we have meal trains, we are standing in solidarity with one another. And something that stands out to me about what we have going on at the University of Chicago's violence recovery program, um, we're able to foster this unique partnership with the glass blowing studio. It's called Firebird Community Arts. And it offers young people an opportunity to do an artist development program with others who've experienced community violence. They get the peer support of other facilitators who've experienced these things. We end our sessions with a group. We're reflecting on things like safety, emotion, loss, and future. We call that self group. And to be in community with one another and share these experiences already is tremendous in and of itself. But when you think about what gun violence, what interpersonal violence might take away from you, and you layer that onto what happens in Chicago, where young people feel like, oh, I can't go over there. Like, I can't go across this street. I can't go this direction because so and so lives over there. That set is over there. And I have, I'm into it with them. And to think about, you know, 13, 14, and 15-year-olds living in a city where they have boundaries and confines like that is already a hard reality to face. And once you remove the trust and the sense of safety that comes with being violently injured, getting people back into community is the only way that we can rebuild some of those pieces that have been lost. It's not easy, and I think I echo some of Carol's sentiment here when I say that level 1 trauma centers and healthcare facilities are not set up for healing. They are treat and street. It is about, medical readiness more than it is about a recovery. And for that reason, I think it's, boundlessly important that we're all connected in this work, because we all deeply understand that recovery and healing is so much beyond being at the doctor.
Thank you. Thank you, Trey. And I do have a question for you all from someone on the webinar, and they want to know, how do you take care of yourself with all the emotions the work comes with?
I can answer that. I embrace the emotions. Right before we started the webinar, I shared that I was in circle with two of the elders and two maestras, Maestra Susie and Maestra Deb, and I sat there and I allowed them to pour into me, and so being humble. I think humility is how I take care of myself. Being humble to understand that I can't carry it, that I need to find alternative ways to carry the carga, the baggage. I'm very protective of my weekends. Very, very extremely protective of my weekends. And that is the moment where I'm able to center myself with my family, ground myself with our purpose. That is my real life there, keeping that in mind, that I can love I can love to serve. I can love my community, but I also have a responsibility to myself and those that come from me. And so being humble to understand that I need to slow down. And also, like I said, being very, very extremely protective of my personal time. Very protective. That means, putting alarms on my emails and letting I'm not going to be responding from this time to that time, right? Making sure that I'm not on my phone answering emails, text messages that are work related that come in at 2 a.m, that can actually wait. They're not urgent, or they're not an emergency. Being intentional about that, being intentional about honoring my real life, and making sure that I show up for that in full-heartedly and completely.
Really appreciate you answering that, Alma. And I want to say, I mean, this has definitely been, I know we're coming to time, but this has been just wonderful. And I'm really and truly thankful for everything that you have shared. And we even had another response, not so much a question, but just a feeling from those in the webinar said, I want to say that what you all are expressing is how we begin to heal. Everyone beginning to care about another's experience. So I just, I love that. I love that of everything that you've been able to share today, your vulnerability, and all that you gave in this webinar for everyone today. And, like I said, we're coming up on that time. I want to be able to make sure I honor everyone's time, but I'm just so thankful for everyone joining us today. Right. And for, again, all of your words and your passion to this topic. To my panelists, thank you for everything that you've shared. Again, I know I can't say it enough, but I'm just so thankful, for your knowledge, your wisdom, and your ability to just share that with us as we are all going through a lot of this, and then, trying to understand the best ways to heal and move forward through this grief and loss, right? And I'm thankful again for everyone that has joined, for your voice, your contributions, and everything that you truly continue to do. And panel, did any other words that you'd love to say, or final reflections that you have for those that are on here?
I wanted to share something else before we part. I just want to make sure that I express this. The antidote of fear and division is love and community. And I invite us all to really reflect on that. What that represents or what that means, because the way things are right now are intentionally happening so that we are disconnected, we are divided. But the antidote of fear and division is love and community.
I think there's anything else. I think Alma said it.
Perfect. And I know that I do want to say, yes, this is recorded, so you will be able to access this again. And I do want to put in another note right quick, those on the line, that the HAVI's membership application cycle is currently open. So I do want to let you know that a deadline of March 13th, and you can learn more about that, the membership categories, eligibility, and benefits at thehavi.org. So I just wanted to make sure I share that and let you know that that's open. As I said, we're coming down to the last few minutes of our time together. And, I, again, just appreciate everything that everyone has done. We had like one thing we wanted to do was kind of center ourselves and ground ourselves as we moved, from here, because we know that we've talked about a lot, right? And you all have shared some deep and some heavy things, and those in the audience were probably, even resonating, with so much of what you have said, and reflecting on some of their own experiences, right? As you all talked, whether it was through the grief and loss, whether it was through the healing and what that looked like. And so one of the big things that we definitely also wanted to do with everyone was to just, take some time we just want to make sure everyone takes that time to ground themselves back, right? Especially after having and going through something so heavy. And so in these last couple of minutes, as we're sitting here together, I would love for us to just, just bring awareness to our body right now. Bring awareness to what it feels like to, soften ourselves right now, soften the tension in our back, soften our shoulders, soften our jaw. You can close your eyes if you'd like to. You can drift your gaze downward if you'd like to. You can rest your hands in your lap or on your thighs. And then these last couple of minutes, I just want you to be able to scan your body and see what it feels like right now before we head off, right? And go back, to our day and everything that our day has to hold. If we can just take a moment to scan our body and see what it feels like, if we can scan for tightness, if we can scan for tension, are we clenching? And if we are doing any of that, if we can release it, right, and just soften those areas as much as possible. If we can just become aware of our breathing right now, breathing in through our nose and out through our mouth, and just making sure that we are focusing on our breath and taking that time, because as we find ourselves in these stressful times, we feel the weight of the emotions, we feel disbelief, sadness, anxiety, anger, everything that we put into those words, and just let our breath be constant, right? Let that be life sustaining. Let that honor ourselves, our teammates, and all those who support us and the work that we do every day. And as you breathe and in those breaths, may you continue to just, feel and breathe out the fear, the stress, the self-doubt, the worry, and know that you are not alone. Together, we are even more powerful. And may you feel the weight of this world on your shoulders, just ease and know that together we can carry it. And so we're at the top of this hour. I want to thank Laura for also with this meditation that I was just speaking and for sharing that with us. And I just want to thank you all again for being with us today for this second webinar. And we look forward to you all coming again to the next one in this series. And thank you all again. Have a wonderful rest of your day, a wonderful rest of the week, and we will see you soon.
Be safe. Take care of each other one day at a time.